Hey guys, it's Wands, and you know, it's kinda sad to look at all the other people talking about music online and realizing they're all so much more passionate about the medium than I am. These people are letting music take over their whole lives, meanwhile I'm over here listening to Imagine Dragons, oblivious to the ills of the world. Clearly I'm not a music nerd just yet. At most I'd consider myself a song nut, and all the other kids on the playground just call me album fucker. But if I want to know how to get better at music discussion, then I need to get that information from only the most reputable of sources. Oh wait, we're not going that far just yet. I could feel myself getting more racist by the second. Ugh. So if I can't infiltrate the music nerds from the inside, then I guess I'll have to learn their ways from out here with whatever I can get my hands on. And what better way to get inside the mind of a music nerd than to listen to the album synonymous with the culture, that being In the Aeroplane Over the Sea by the band Neutral Milk Hotel. By 1997, Neutral Milk Hotel, a passion project indie rock band led by singer-songwriter Jeff Mangum, had already begun seeing modest underground popularity. Their first official album, 1996's On Avery Island, was genuinely enjoyed by critics and sold over 5,000 copies, which, although relatively low, was considered a success both by their small independent label and by Mangum, since he never cared about the monetary viability of his music. The musical style of Avery Island, and of the band in general, was very simplistic and intentionally rough around the edges. The main focus of their songs was usually a single guitar with other acoustic folk instruments sprinkled in, and was often distorted to either give a raw, lo-fi quality or to give me a headache. You see, now we're getting into the real artsy territory where people are making their songs sound bad on purpose. During the national tour for On Avery Island, beginning in April of 1997, Mangum was already writing and making demos for almost every song on the next album. He would also recruit more members for the band while on this tour, being multi-instrumentalists Julian Coster, Jeremy Barnes, and Scott Spillane. So with more members and the increased funds earned from this tour, the band would be able to flesh out and expand their sound on the next record. And lyrically speaking, a big inspiration for Mangum around this time would be The Diary of Anne Frank. It emotionally resonated with him so much he took multiple days to recuperate from it, and although it's not the main theme of the album, parts of Anne Frank's story are referenced in a handful of songs. The band aimed to make an album that reminds the listener of childhood nostalgia, with topics like the struggles of growing up and the confusing feelings involved in young love. And the results of their effort would be unveiled on February 10th, 1998, when In the Aeroplane Over the Sea would be officially released. Honestly, I don't trust people who spell airplane like that. Like, if I named my son Airplane, I'd be a bad parent, but at least he wouldn't get bullied as much as the kid whose douchebag dad named him Aeroplane. After its release, it expectedly sold about as well as Avery Island, and was generally considered quality among critics, but opinions were more mixed than they were for the last album, since more larger publications had gotten their hands on it. It was surprisingly contentious for the time, with many critics attributing the initial positive response to the record as a confused reaction to a surprisingly mediocre project. However, the album's release would also coincide with the early rise of the internet, so many early music message boards and reviewing sites would provide more positive reception and publicity to both the record and the band. This more widespread attention would have a toll on Mangum's mental state, as he would become increasingly more isolated until eventually the band would officially be broken up sometime later. Mangum's new recluse nature, as well as the growing cult following for the band, would inadvertently make him a mysterious, larger-than-life figure in the indie music scene, which would be even worse for his continuing mental struggles, but it would also be good for sales, so who cares? The band's new place as folk hipster gods would lead to a huge critical reappraisal for In the Aeroplane Over the Sea. With a dedicated fanbase for the music, over 300,000 additional album sales, and several reviewing sites giving the record high and even perfect scores throughout the years. This dedication for the fandom would eventually lead to Mangum re-entering the public to release solo music in 2008, and a full reunion tour for the band in 2013. So clearly the cult following this album attained is what led to its late-stage commercial success and its almost unanimously glowing reviews. This is being sold as a flawless piece of high art, and that's a lot of pressure to put on 40 minutes of Holocaust-inspired vaguely horny indie rock, so let's take a look at In the Aeroplane Over the Sea, so I can finally learn just how the nerds got so enlightened to their perfect taste in music.
The cover art is always a good indicator for the music we'll be in for, and to be honest, this is a pretty good design. The artwork is an edit of a 20th century postcard depicting two old-timey swimmers and a woman sitting on a dock, with her head being replaced by what appears to be a drum. But with it being such a simple drawing, people online have debated over whether or not this is a drum, or a tambourine, or a potato slice, or a bunch of other things. Personally, I think that this is just how her face looks, and you guys are just mean. Once the image was edited, it was scanned onto an old piece of paper and dirtied up, both giving it a more aged appearance and being a neat allegory for the band's production style. I do think this art works very well at establishing the tone of the music and to represent the themes present in the lyrics.
Yep, when looking at this cover, I now fully know what to expect when listening to this album. That means I don't have to, right?
Yeah, I'll admit that I've been hesitant to listen to this record in full for a long time. When I heard the one song I did out in the wild, I wasn't too impressed, and whenever I saw it being talked about, it was only people saying how overrated it was.
Overrated things can still have some value, just look at the UK, but my first impressions of this album have been tainted by the massive, unwavering support for it, and the constant stream of cynicism because of that acclaim. But I'm not gonna learn the way of the basement dweller just by calling people who like this album basement dwellers, although it is very fun. So it's about time I take a listen to this for myself, so I can finally learn what all of the hype has truly been about.
The opening song is titled The King of Carrot Flowers, and it's about becoming the greatest vegetable farmer in all of Ohio. It's a pretty simple and effective folk song with mostly just a guitar and the vocals throughout. There really isn't much to criticize, mostly because there isn't much to talk about. But despite the song's simplicity, there is one thing that confused me. Is there a reason this song is split into two parts, or that one of the two parts contains two parts? Well, listening to part 2, which is also part 3, it is different enough to warrant being separated. In fact, they're almost completely different, and besides them transitioning into one another, they have pretty much nothing in common. Part 2 doesn't call back to part 1 musically at any point, and the lyrics aren't even about the same thing to my knowledge, so I can't think of a reason why they needed to share a name. But what part 2 does do is introduce us to the second half of this album's musical arsenal. That being the instruments being distorted to the point where you can barely tell what you're listening to. It feels like a little much here, but I'm sure they'll only use it a necessary amount throughout the album. So the Carrot Flowers trilogy is a pretty good introduction to what the album has to offer, at least in terms of musical ideas and its main theme. It'll be interesting to see how the album expands on the ideas introduced in these songs.
Hey guys, I just looked up what foreshadowing means. You're not gonna like this.
The next song is the title track, and thank God, because I had forgotten what the album was called by this point.
Oh.
This was the first song I had heard from the album, and I think it's pretty good on its own, and on the album it's used well to come down from all the... It's pretty similar to part 1 of Carrot Flowers, although the other instruments come into the song quicker, so it feels less repetitive and a little more full and fleshed out. I especially thought the 10-second squeaky door hinge solo was a nice touch. And to continue the pattern of an alright song having a confusing one after it, Two-Headed Boy feels unfinished. It's just a guitar and Mangum singing again, but it sounds like absolutely no processing was done to his voice. Or if not, the only thing they did was add distortion to it, so whenever he does his nasally wail singing, catching signals that sound enough, it sounds really grating, and the fact that it's the only real sound I have to focus on in the song makes it even worse. Fortunately, this is the only song on the album that has this issue to this degree, but that just makes this an even more disorienting decision. The guitar in the song is fine, but at this point I started to wonder if all these songs were just gonna sound the same. Everything before this had either been too spare to have passionate feelings for, or too grating to want to return to on their own, or some combination of the two. Thankfully, Two-Headed Boy transitions nicely into this instrumental, old-timey funeral-sounding song called The Fool, which is genuinely a good piece of music, though I probably wouldn't listen to it on its own, and if it were removed from the album, I doubt much would change. Next up, we have Holland 1945, which is actually the only single released for the album, so yeah, this song's another wall of noise, which feels like a weird choice for the kind of song to release separately from the album. It's fine if they were going for an effect like this, but the amount of distortion they use for these types of songs feels so unnecessarily high, and I doubt it even symbolizes anything in the themes of the record. Lyrically, this is one of the songs that makes heavy references to the Diary of Anne Frank, and if Mangum thinks it's important and fits with the album's themes, then sure, it makes sense. But all I'm saying is that if this is what people think Anne Frank's story sounds like, then I'd probably deny the Holocaust too.
Although I will admit, the song did have an effect on me. I am deaf now.
After that, we have another guitar-centric song, Communist Daughter, but this track does attempt some things differently than similar previous ones. Firstly, it has some ambient and otherworldly sounds in the background in order to add more atmosphere to the song than could be made with just a singular instrument. And secondly, instead of the guitar going like da 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 da, this one goes all like da 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 da. The song does talk about the same themes of young love as in earlier tracks, although it seems to reach the point where things are going a little further.
Semen stains the mountaintop. Semen stains the mountaintop.
Now this lyric is actually using symbolism to comment on the economic decay of 1950s Russia. You see, the mountaintops represent titties.
The next song is titled Oh Comely, and for some context on the writing process for this album, Mangum often employed a subconscious process to his lyrics, where a lot of the ideas came from a stream of consciousness or were inspired by things like dreams. And afterwards, he would string these often unconnected ideas together into a single song with a common theme. It's a very interesting take on the creation of lyrics, and the reason I'm telling you all this is because this song is 8 minutes long and it absolutely did not need to be. It's another guitar-only song for most of it, which is already starting to get tedious this far in, except here it's like that for over 6 minutes. I'm sure Mangum just had a lot to say about the struggles of growing into adulthood, just as much as I'm sure any coffee shop with a poetry night would like this song much more than I did listening to it casually. If I was already turned off by the repetitive nature of this album, a whole song 3 times longer than the rest without any real changes or surprising elements really wouldn't be staining my mountaintops.
Smelling of semen.
There's a disturbing amount of cum on this album.
Thankfully, it seemed the album realized it was getting monotonous, since the intro to the song Ghost does give an interesting subversion of the tropes we've seen thus far. You see, for this segment, there's a guitar in one ear and an overly distorted mess in the other. So if you only needed a headache on the right side of your brain, then do I have a song for you. But the guitar is drowned out by noise quickly after, so it goes back to not being that notable. This next song is another instrumental, and this time with no actual title, which gives more fuel to my theory that someone tripped and hit the release masterpiece button too early.
Oh, Pitchfork's gonna hate us.
I'm guessing that for it to be a counterpart to The Fool, this one is the distorted instrumental track, and I think it's best described as Scottish party music parentheses bass boosted edition 2016. On the other hand, this is the only song to make heavy use of synthesizers, which was an interesting change of pace. And finally, we have Two-Headed Boy Part 2, and if you were expecting something to shake things up in the conclusion, you won't find much. Besides it being longer than usual and shifting to a reprise of Two-Headed Boy towards the end, this is just another standard guitar song, which is an unfortunately anticlimactic finish to this infamous and surprisingly underwhelming album.
So overall, I wouldn't consider In the Aeroplane Over the Sea to be one of the best albums of all time. But I would still consider it an alright record.
It's not hard to imagine why certain people would enjoy this album as much as they do, even if I think a perfect score is pushing it no matter what. Personally, if I had any phrase to describe this album, it would be neutral milk. My taste in music is pretty mainstream, so I'm sure if I were into the noise rock or acoustic orchestral arrangements this album provides, I would have enjoyed it much more than I ended up doing. The main issue I had was that in a vacuum, these musical ideas are pretty serviceable, and there were individual songs I enjoyed, but as a whole project, there's barely anything to keep these songs from just blending into one another. And lyrically, the ideas of the songs are both too on the nose and too drowned in metaphor at the same time for me to connect with them that deeply. For a more general audience-friendly comparison, imagine if that one White Stripes song, We're Gonna Be Friends, was written by Fall Out Boy. Like, it's really obvious on a surface level what these songs are about, but on some songs these simple messages are made needlessly complicated with a bunch of vague allusions for things that should be pretty easy to grasp on their own. Except in Fall Out Boy's case, that actually enhances the band's persona, but here it just hinders me connecting to the song's themes. I don't have a problem inherently with records that stay consistent with a theme or even share musical aspects throughout their songs, but I also prefer if they keep adding new things or developing on their ideas so every song doesn't feel so interchangeable and unsurprising. So overall, either if you like In the Aeroplane Over the Sea or not, I understand where you're coming from. Its quality is very much based on people people's varying tastes, and the debate over whether or not it's overrated will definitely last far longer than me at this moment saying yes.
But all that understanding of other people's views doesn't matter, because I didn't learn anything. I didn't agree with the popular opinion, so that means there still must be something wrong with me. I'll never be a music nerd if I don't fix my nuanced view of popular media. There's gotta be an album somewhere that can show me what perfect music sounds like. Why didn't no one tell me?